Greetings, everybody. My name is Matthew Guarini, and I'm the Executive Director of the TBM Council. And I'm here today with Howard Rubin. And Howard and I are launching the third episode of our podcast called The Real ROI of Tech. Howard, how are you doing today?
Doing great. I'm very pleased to be part of all this with you and the TBM team.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. We've had some great conversations so far. Today, I wanted to go into one that we're hearing a bunch of. We caught a lot of it when we were out at our board invitational recently. People were saying, how do you measure the value of AI? And so what I wanted to start with is, Howard, from your perspective, what is different about AI than other technology innovations we've seen over the last decade, whether it was digital, cloud, mobile? What do you see as it being different? And what do you see as it being the same?
Well, I sort of start at the top. And to start at the top, by that I mean what it's about. We've never had a technology, except maybe when the internet was born, that said it's going to change everything. So now we have things that change society and business and impact jobs and everything else. So the breadth of what AI can impact seems to be wider than everything else. And I think that's really what's out there. Plus, it has a level of hype driven by the markets that we've never, ever seen before, despite blockchain and everything else. So it's like the hype of the hype, or hype squared, and it's affecting a broader range of a spectrum of things that gets to everybody, even in their homes.
Yeah, I think that's that increase in scope and scale, right? I think are key. Complexity is a big thing. And one of the interesting things that we learned a bunch around, we did an exercise where we had people go to one of four corners in the room, depending on who's leading AI in their organization. And we had pretty equal splits between three of the corners, one being the CEO, one being the CFO, and one being the tech leader, the CIO or the CTO. The other corner, CAIOs are much smaller, but there is some of that. So you do see much more stakeholder involvement, I think, than you did in some of these other technologies as well.
And I would say the thing about AI, and the reason there's a lot of failures on it right now, it can't be just driven from the tech side. It's not a tech issue side. It's about a business side, a workflow side, and so on. And it really has to be engineered from the outside in, what you're trying to get from the business. The technologies could say what offers AI makes to change things, and you have to link the two of them together. But if you start from the tech side, you never look at the value. If you don't talk to the business, they have to think about where the value comes from. And that's the other failure. You see all the articles about maturity and all this other stuff. There's no world shortage of maturity models, I must say, but without value focus, and the value focus is going to come from the business or propositions from the tech people. But you've got to connect those dots. And that's what the big failure is right now.
So your outside in point is very interesting, because in my former life working at Forrester, one of the things that they always talked about was being customer led. And in this case with AI, that's the critical thing, and this happened in mobile too, by the way. The person who runs research over at Forrester released a blog recently where she was talking about how in mobile, people build a bunch of things that no one wanted or needed. And with AI right now, you do see some of that because people aren't listening to their customers, whether it's the employee or the actual people that give you $1 revenue. So I do think that's a very pertinent point. Let's hold on that one. Before we get to more of the value side, I do just want to start with, if you're going to get the value from AI, you got to know the cost side of things, right? And so, what did we learn from these previous errors that we can use and apply to AI to measure the cost of how we're spending cost?
And you really have to get down to the cost attribution for AI, because that has to do with everything from how it's used and where it's used and the labor required, even into the underpinnings of it. And we'll get into tokens later, but even the charges and how it affects us. Because the really first broad-based, consumption-based cost model in technology, cloud purported to do that, where you bought it by cloud by the drink and stuff. But suddenly right now, and that's what you see in the news every day, companies are blowing up their budgets because they're not watching the token side. So sorry to introduce that piece, but it's very different in tracing where the cost occurs, where the stakeholders fit into the cost, because you can't do this without the business. And it's not about AI coding. It's not about any of that other stuff. Even agentic, you have to get into the workflow and what's going on. So the cost really goes beyond just the tech organization. And historically, we always look at IT and technology costs in the business and out of the business. This is total technology cost in the enterprise, no matter where it is. It's almost like taking a factory, including the process control and the machines, as part of your tech costs. So organizations have to learn to look at total technology costs no matter what. And it's even bigger issue right now with the cost of AI because it permeates everything.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about tokens because one of the things I see right now, and you mentioned it already, we've seen what happened with Uber blowing their budget, Microsoft restricting or pulling back on Claude and things like that. Is there an element of groupthink going on where everyone just assumes that the way to do this is work with the large, the large language models with the big open AIs and Anthropics, and just you're going to pay by the tokens? Are there other strategies that people can deploy to better manage that variable cost component?
There's so many lessons to be learned in the long-term hype of technology that people think that whatever the latest, greatest is one way of doing things. And not to take us back in time, the cloud came up. So everyone went cloud first. Now it's going to be, where does cloud fit? So the whole theory right now of everything we're doing in technology economics is things have to be fit for purpose. And when you get to fit for purpose, you fall into a real hybrid view. You'll look at the purpose, you'll look at the economics, you'll look at the value it produces. So it becomes a mix of things that are tuned to work where your business works. And that's where this stuff fits in. You don't need large language models for everything. You don't need cloud for everything. I'm not picking on anything. Even when relational databases come out, SQL, everything's going to be database. It doesn't work that way. You still have large volume transaction systems and everything else. So obviously I can go on and lecture about this, but it will always be hybrid. There's no way of doing things, one way of doing it. There's no one diet for everybody on the planet. There's no one type of phone or whatever you look at. So it's a mix, but it's about fit for purpose. Think of those terms, and that always leads you to hybrid, because fit for purpose means you have a number of choices and you choose them based on what I consider to be the technology economics, which is the cost side and the value side, and not just the accounting side. How's
Yeah,
that for an
that's a
answer?
great one because I think, one of the places I've been talking to a lot of people about is just that word hybrid. Hybrid cloud, people called that real early on, a few big important people, and that's indeed where we ended up. And, now I think it is hybrid AI. I think in certain cases you're going to use that large language model and, you'll work strategies to try and control the variable as much as you can. But then I think people are going to also use SLMs and they'll use them fit for purpose, like you said. And I think people also do it on hosted environments, on on-prem assets. And I think there's ways that they're going to manage their cost and still deliver value. And you see it with some of these lower cost models that deliver almost the same capabilities. That's a big trade-off someone has to make.
Yeah, and if you think about even the underlying technology of all the processing required for AI, it's not all about having the highest powered GPUs for everything. So even with regard to that, you're going to start to see more evolution of structured level at the chipsets. We have chipsets
Mm.
that are fit for purpose. So you don't have to, this is going to sound terrible, but in 5 years, most of these mega data centers they're building are going to become obsolete. They're going to be other chipsets more efficient. So there's a whole bunch of overbuilding, in my opinion, going on that's driving up the cost of everything
Yes.
by not having fit for purpose, basically even down to the chipset and power and consumption and environmental impact level. So exactly,
Now,
hybrid is right.
Now, one other thing I want to go back to on the cost before we switch to the value side is I hear a lot of people talk about the FinOps side of things, and FinOps is a valuable tool for those variable costs that you see in the public cloud side of things. But like you were pointing out, it feels like if you're going to get to the full cost or the full array of costs, a lot of it sits outside of the IT organization. And so for that full reckoning, that's how we're trying to position TBM. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so the origins of FinOps were people trying to cope with the economics of the cloud, which is sort of interesting. So now you're starting from the inside out versus what it's doing. And then number two, FinOps started to hit a wall with the idea of even how do you look at those economics and get to value. So FinOps, is evolving, and you'll see right now they're starting to talk about value and stuff. If you look at TBM, and it sounds like an advertisement for TBM, but TBM has that full stack in the models that you have, Adam and the latest frameworks, and it gets up to the level of the value. So what happens is it's the origin of FinOps is looking at some micro issues about, and I hate to be rude to them, but cloud spending has been about 5% of the IT budgets. You don't have visibility into the other 95%. You start in a corner. It's like weighing your big toe to figure out how your body is doing. It just doesn't work that way. And you've got to figure out the whole health and the whole ecosystem of technology and how it produces value. So this is not an advertisement for
Great.
TBM. And FinOps has a power in examining some of the financial aspects of some things. It's not even truly fixed versus variable because the contracts have ceilings and floors, which blows that
Hmm.
away. So FinOps is a big deal, but that became off the cloud wave.
So let's switch into the value side of things, and what you're talking about there too. This is where with TBM we try to position it to be able to get to business value, right? And so, this is that opportunity to move just beyond IT, get a broader view of the values generated. But how does somebody who's looking at AI, how do they really start to think about getting into that business value side of things? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, most definitely. This might take me more than 1 minute, so forgive me. But anyway, the issue is, and when you start looking at value, there's the internal value to the business. And folks can tell by the way I talk, I was a professor and maybe sound too academic. So if you look how companies compete, they compete on operational excellence and efficiency, they compete on customer intimacy, and they compete on getting product to market. So those are the things. So how do you tie to those metrics to have meaning to the business? And literally, what do you end up doing? You end up protecting revenue, uh, creating revenue, avoiding costs, reducing costs. There are things that are a little risk focused. There's attracting talent. There are a whole stack of things you can do and look at where value would show up for an external business perspective. But you can take that one level further, because if you look at valuations of companies, we're talking about public companies. You can do similar things with governments and stuff, looking at the value to the constituents you have. But you have to bring this back to stakeholder value. And you need to start looking at ratios of, I don't, again, this take a moment longer, but like one of the big banks spends about $3 billion a year on AI. That's the number. They figured out their costs. They have 3 billion shares of stock. What does that do? It loads every share of stock with $1 of value, $1 of
Hmm.
AI cost. And let's say that their earnings per share is $5. If they blow AI and get no value, takes out $1 of the $5 in EPS. So suddenly you've knocked the EPS down 20%. What the heck that does to shareholder value? So the different places of measuring value, and you need to be measuring in the context of the business, what's important to the business and the business strategy, as I said, and there's a whole list of metrics on that. But number two, and maybe that's nearly number one, is for public companies looking at the shareholder value and the AI risk factor is, what are you spending on AI as a percent of your EPS? What's your load by doing these projects per share? And what happens if you get a miss? And that's what's going on right now. So the tech companies are making a lot of money because they're doing it on their stock and they have all the circular funding between each other.
Hmm.
But what is the bottom line of a company? If you screw up AI, you don't know where the value is, and you have the value is time. You better figure out what it means to shareholder value and what that reaction will be, and connect the dots all the way up and out there to the
Yeah.
street.
And I think some people say, well, there's a time value of money. You got to invest now to create the value later. We had that similar logic in cloud and in, digital and things like that. The difference is the magnitude of money that people are spending on AI is so expansive that it actually can really move those
Yeah,
financial results in the wrong
200% different.
direction.
Because you have to look at the technology cost of capital. That's
Yeah.
really different. The opportunity cost lost by spending on this stuff and doing this stuff. So there are other things in the equation now that are just critical to understand. And you
Yeah.
just mentioned the issue of how expensive this stuff is in the data center buildup. The other, and again, this is the time we just did this. I mean, Oracle had a big miss yesterday or something. Whatever date we're on, in June 2026, they had a big miss. Why they have a big miss? Because the cloud business is not thriving. The AI business is the way they thought. Sorry, because of IT inflation. Because the other thing is as the change in cost of tokens and everything and move around, it's another factor of inflation for IT that no one has thought of. So there are all sorts of economic forces that are in play. And that's why I talk about technology economics, technology cost of capital, the impact of
Fantastic.
the stuff on inflation, and all the other stuff.
Yeah, and I think, Howard, people can look for your through technology economist, and we'll echo some of it. You're going to be releasing some work, I think, on some of these new metrics, and I know you've got some really cool research you've done around the EPS and some of those analyses. Correct?
Yeah, and actually, you'll start to see I have a forthcoming book. It's called The Cost of Intelligence. And the cover of the
Mhm.
book, it says, sometimes when I teach, I tell students to buy books and just read the covers because the covers are more interesting than the books. But anyway, the thing is, the theme of that book is you're starting to know the cost of AI. but few people know the value of AI. So
Yeah.
how do you connect those dots? And that's one of the paradoxes right now. And the companies that really need to use AI can't afford it because the economics is so severe. And the companies that can afford it are investing in it, but not getting the value. So they're squeezing their margins. So the paradox is if you need it, you can't afford it. If you're going to afford it, you're going to overspend and you're going to hurt
Yeah.
something else. And we'll come out of that time base, like you said.
Now, just one closing thing here. I started asking what's different about AI. My observation, and sometimes I'm too simple, is yeah, it's different, but a lot of what we're seeing is similar to what we've done in these previous eras. It just, like we said, more complex, bigger scope and scale, more stakeholders. Agree, disagree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. And you asked the question early on, and the again the scale and scope of what AI can hit. The hype is out there, and if you take a look at the whole history of technology, and we discussed this at your TBM summit last November in Miami, you can go through every change going back to the birth of the internet, to e-commerce, to blockchain. Everything had hype about it, and each of these things isn't just standalone, but nothing has had a major inflection point because society-wise and hype-wise, people treat adopting this stuff as a fashion statement. And I don't know what people want to say, but you see firms, there's a new class of vanity metrics. People ask, how are you doing with AI? And they say, we have this many use cases. I ask CIOs, do you want, and this is a rude thing to say, you want your tombstone to say he or she who dies with the most use cases wins. It does not work. I've gotten fired because I said that.
There you go.
But they're using vanity metrics instead of outcome and value metrics. And that is a big mistake.
That's a great way to close this episode. We appreciate everybody joining us. You can find the podcast on Spotify, YouTube. If you give us a like, we would appreciate that as well. So until next time, thank you very much, Howard.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
I hope that last statement doesn't get me in trouble. Thanks, Matthew.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.
So long.